What's up, sports performance mentorship? We are on video 3. This one will be a lot shorter because each video before this, you should watch them in order. I'll make sure that is clearly articulated when these get posted. Each video before this talks about a couple programming global strategies that we use when we write our programs. But I wanted to use this example of our total performance. So again, you'll see total performance, 12 to 18, a little bit more, I'll say advanced athletes. I don't think they're really more advanced. I think they're probably just bigger kids. It doesn't mean that they know how to skip any better than an 8-year-old. It just means that they've maybe played sports longer, so they have more movement context. Maybe. You'll see linear speed focused training session, and specifically, this is a volume-based progression like Jumpstart is, but there's also some movement complexity increases in here as well. I don't know if this would be a typical progression that we would use in our programming, because you'll see there's both volume and complexity. I'll say that's probably not normal for us. That would be something more on our semi-private and one-on-one training side, where we can really give that athlete, I'll say like direct individual programming to their skill level. So we can do both. There's a little bit more of a match on skill readiness and programming that matches there. But I wanted to, for the sake of examples, show you what that would look like. I think that's important. I'm not going to do something because it's not something you wouldn't see, right? Right. Cool. So same thing, list out our pillars. You'll see movements very similar. The biggest difference is going to be actually no difference here in stationary movements. The only thing you see is different is we add in the back half of the first phase, we make the switch from straight reps to seconds. Let's see what it looks like. I'm not going to need to justify it any more than that. Like, we'll see what it looks like. And if it looks bad, we'll go back to straight reps. And if it looks good, we'll start that progression a little early. From there, movement wise, you'll see we progress by way of velocity, locomotion, marching. Then we'll go into an ISO hold in between the marching sets. Like, I think hopefully that's relayed here, where these are kind of mushed together, right? We're going to march. I'm going to see what those front side mechanics look like. If they're not that good, we're going to go into holds and we're going to coach those up, like limb height, limb angles. I want the athletes to see it, feel it. And then we'll add some more speed here, front skip, speed skip. You'll see our yardage increases a touch, just a touch. And that's because on these speed skips and front skips, the actual like locomotion, you have some propulsion. And if it was 10 yards, you could do it, but you probably are going to have some horizontal coverage there. So we add the distance so that we can get a little bit more reps in. Could you program this off of reps? Sure. You could program it off anything, time, whatever, but the barrier constraint is probably going to be the practical approach here. You'll see first 2 weeks sets stay the same, 3s to 4s, and then we cut down on the mechanical work and we increase on the actual application work all the way up to 6 sets in the last week here on the speed skip, because that's our finished product. Like, this is the goal, and everything leading up to this is going to be a practice for that goal. And I want, at the end of that 4-week block, I want our athletes to be very proficient in that speed skip with a lot of the mechanical pieces that go into that on display. Ground activation, you'll see again, following that same 4x4 matrix progression, we're going to start on the ground. We're going to progress prone supine to half kneeling to quadruped, and then we're going to finish with that ballistic stretch again. I just like putting it at the end. I want an athlete to be like really ready before they start putting that ballistic movement in there. That's just the way it is. I don't have anything else other than that. You'll see our volume will actually decrease towards the end there. Mostly because these are more, I'll say, more demanding movements, the prone hurdler and the rolling V-sit. You've got movement banks if you want to go see what those look like. And then, yeah, that's just anecdotally n equals 1. Or maybe you agree with me, maybe you don't. And I will say, on that same notion, you might look at this ADW and be like, Casey, trash. Why'd you do this? Let's talk about it. That's totally cool. I think that, like I said in the Jumpstart video before this is not like the end all be all ADW. This is an example of a couple ways to progress athletes, whether it be from volume or from movement complexity. And in this case, both. It's just an example. I'm showing you how we do it in Parisi land. I don't, I'm not here to say this is the best ADW ever. Please don't take it that way. That would be silly of me. Okay, so here's where the money probably comes in the learning element of this video. Specifically, I'm going to jump right to the different looking things here. We're going to go to the movement section. What we're going to do here is you'll see that march, right, with the iso hold in between the marches. We go right to our front skip, and then we're going to take that speed skip. And you saw how we ended on week 4 of phase 1 with 6 total sets. And that was almost like a primer. Like, I want to see where my athletes are at as we go into the next phase, because we're going to get a little bit more dynamic with it. Ooh. We're going to go into our quick steps, our thigh drives, and then some transitional work in there. And what you'll see with the black bars here, this is really where, so thigh drive to sprint, this is going to be the harder variation. So we're going to save that for the last 2 weeks. So I blacked it out for the first 2 weeks, just like I blacked out my quick step to thigh drive here on the end. Now, could I do quick step to thigh drive and thigh drive to sprint? Yeah, I totally could. But for the sake of showing movement complexity progression, I wanted you to just see how that would look on a program from our standpoint. Okay, so I'll say that one more time. Could I do both? Yes, but for the sake of example, it looks the way it looks, so you can see what it looks like, how we would write it, because it's what you signed up for. Yeah, so there you go. I try to keep the practical approach here, people, practical approach. But you'll see, again, it's actually very consistent week over week with the movements leading up to it. 1, 2, 3 sets. The big changes are going to be here on the back end. And again, we're finishing the last 2 weeks, 4 to 6 sets. I would leave this up if I was programming for a facility, if I was programming for my coaches in-house, or even for me. I would say, let's see, I want to get 4. Let's see what it looks like. And if it looks like we could keep going, let's keep going. If the kid looks mechanically shot, if I start to notice the speed of the limbs start to slow down, if I go from 4 sets to 5 sets and that 5th set's not looking like set 3 or 4, we'll stop, right? And then we'll just attack it next week. Like that's totally fine. So when you see the ranges here, 3 to 5, 4 to 6, I always like to give basically like a 2 rep variation in there. So that way a coach can say, okay, it's starting to not look like it's supposed to. The speed is not supposed to be where it is, or isn't getting to where it's supposed to be. Let's back off. Let's move on to the next thing, right? Like, I want them to have that ownership. I want a coach to have that ownership. Could we do the same ranges here leading up to? Sure. But what I've found is when I'm writing the programs, and this is, I say this as someone who was the director of a facility for 12 years before joining the corporate team, a lot of coaches will fade into the higher side of the volume for the sake of making it hard on their athlete. Oh, we're going to just do 2 sets of this, like 2 sets, 3 sets, 5 sets, 6 sets, just because it's the higher side. And that's what makes it hard. We have to appreciate, and Steve Leo, our lead master coach in the Paris Network, says this, like, if you're not running fast, you're not training speed. Like, if the limb speed can't be at the velocity it needs to, just to do more isn't going to get the response you want for the athlete. And we heard Michelle this week say the same thing. Like, if the athlete's beat up, what do we got going on? Like, that's just, it's gone, right? Like, it's just, there's just nothing there. So I think that, for us as coaches, we need to appreciate what the athlete's going to give us in the exercise, in the set rep that we're in. And when the athlete can't give us what we want, we either make the decision to cut volume and stop where we're at and go on to the next thing that we get a good training response out of, or regress the movement, right? And that's why you'll see here on the back end, like, we don't have both lined up. We have just the finished result. And you'll see, like, if we're going from the thigh drive, we don't need to take the build up for the exercise coming before it. We'll just go right from that thigh drive, and then we'll thigh drive to a sprint. So the movement progression path is still in alignment. We're just finishing with, I'll say, a harder variation, right? Sprinting is going to be more speed, more complexity than a thigh drive will, more horizontal distance, push, everything. So that's what it's going to look like phase 1 to phase 2, where we're progressing now with movement complexity as well as training volume. On the ground, it stays the same. Because I'm changing the movement section so much, almost for just the sake of time and getting it done in the window that I want relative to the entire training section, I'm not going to add too much volume because I know the athlete can get through this efficiently and effectively. I'm just going to keep it the same because I made so many changes here. right? Like the practicality of the training session needs to be kept in mind. I would love to progress everything, but if you're progressing everything at once, that's going to take time for you to coach. It could bog down the entirety of the training session. And at that point, you've got other inefficiencies in your training session. I just don't want to do that. I just don't want to bog down the entire session. I don't want my ADW to go from 12 to 15 minutes to 20 to 23 minutes. I just don't want that. I want those 7 minutes later on in the session for something else relative to what we're trying to coach. The ADW gives us some great coaching opportunities, but the athlete doesn't come to train with me because of a really cool ADW, right? So I need to adhere to that perception element as well. That's just the practicality of people paying to train with you. Like, it's a bummer, but it is what it is. As we move into the last phase here, you'll see same thing. Now we're going to actually move from the thigh drive, right, like those elements, into more of a type progression here, where we've really focused in this second phase on where the foot strikes and the limb recovery movement, where now we're going to work on the linear release movement and the leg recovery element now as the foot recovers and strikes the ground. So we're progressing again by movement complexity. You'll see off the first 2 weeks, we've cut the volume. We've even removed some of the exercises where we're going to start to layer those in as we get good at the base movements. Front skip, no hands, our speed skip, right, that we had from phase 1, we're bringing it back. And then our A march, and then we'll progress the more dynamic, higher velocity movements here on the back half of the training phase. So we're going to progress with some volume, but really we're progressing both volume and movement skill. And that's kind of the goal of the 4 weeks. Like I would express that to the athletes, right? Like, hey guys, like there's going to be a couple ways that we're going to make some progression this training phase. We're going to look to add some movements to this. So here's why we're really focusing on our front skips and A marches this week and next week. And then, we're building on those as we go in, like be transparent about it. But really for a coach, and if I was explaining this to the coaches on staff, like they would see the building blocks being laid for the end product. And that's coaching progression and coaching practice and how programming reflects that. Everything else up top, the biggest difference here, you'll see low pogo, we're adding in a deceleration element, where in the phase leading up to, we just had the pogo. Now we're going to add in that deceleration, bringing in some of that rapid triple flexion that we had when we trained the squat. You can see, like we talked about on our Q&A earlier this week, that, anytime you can check multiple boxes with movement, we love that, but the athletes have to be prepared for it. So you can see, again, adding movement complexity. Training volume really stays largely the same. We've added a couple different sets here. We've added a time constraint. When you move to a time constraint, sometimes you can get away with adding more sets because the time constraint is going to be faster than the actual time to completion when you do straight reps, like 10 squats at 3 seconds to squat, 1 down, 1 in the bottom, 1 up, that's 30 seconds, 10 seconds of squats. Like if you're doing the same, like if you're doing 10 squats in 10 seconds, like you're cranking, right? Like that speed of movement is very different. So it is something when you look at the logistical side of getting the ADW done in a certain amount of time in the whole session, you can get away with adding more sets because of the time constraint. So play around with it. And if you've never programmed off a time, play around with it. It's fun. It's a great challenge in the ADW for your athletes. And that gets them kind of psyched up and kind of gets their mind right. And then again, actually through this entire phase, the entire ground activation never changed. Phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, it never changed. Training volume, movements all stayed the same because there was so much movements being altered and volume being altered in the 2 pillars above it. If it can be effective and efficient on the back half, I can get it done in the time I need to. So, that's something that you heard me talk about a couple minutes ago here. Like, I don't need to progress everything all at once. I want to be very selective on when I do it. And I'll say typically in Parisi land, for us, that comes with the movement piece because we're a movement ground-based school. And this is going to be very closely related. If you eyeball test it, like the skips and the marches, that looks like speed training, which is what an athlete is coming to us to do. and that's how we're going to progress it. Like that's the total performance program. Let's say this is, again, maybe not completely normal what we would do as far as movement complexity and volume, but I would say like what would be more normal would be to just keep the training volume the same and progress with movements. And you would see like the blacked out lines, things like that. That might be more, I'll say normal, traditional, what we would do every day, every training block. This would be probably fading towards like the more advanced side of that total performance. But again, for the sake of example, I wanted to show it because I'm not going to not show it because it's not traditional. Like this is something I think you guys would definitely be into seeing. So here you go. That's total performance. That's the video explanation 3 of 3 for our ADW. Catch you guys later.